I used to read Shel Silverstein's classic children's tale, The Giving Tree, to my freshman geography class. At its most basic level, the story depicts the innocent friendship between the boy and the tree, with the tree providing the boy with shade, apples, and a place to play. At face value, the story symbolizes the simple joys and gifts of nature. As the boy grows older, his needs and desires evolve. He returns to the tree seeking wood to build a house, and the tree, out of love, selflessly offers its branches. The tree's generosity knows no bounds, and as the boy continues to mature, he comes back once more, asking for a boat with which to sail away. This request results in the loss of the tree's once mighty trunk. As he had what he needed, the boy stayed away for a long time, before finally returning as a tired old man. At this point, the tree focuses on what it can't give, neglecting the fact that the boy is far too old to repeat any of his prior demands. All he needs now is a place to rest up against, the boy claims. The tree, now reduced to merely a stump, gives the boy what remains of itself, demonstrating the depth of its enduring love and sacrifice. The story serves as a poignant reflection on the changing dynamics of relationships as well as the concept of unconditional love. The tree's continuous giving represents the selflessness often found in deep connections, while the boy's requests symbolize the evolving needs and desires we encounter regularly in our lives. At least that's what most teachers would say. I, on the other hand, point out quite sarcastically that the boy is doing his part to ensure that humans win the ever-expanding conflict with nature. Sadly, nature's winning that war in the long run. No matter what we build, no matter how much concrete we use to pave over nature, eventually grass will find its way to the surface, forming cracks in the work of man. Climate change is nature's ultimate trump card. For when we talk about the Earth heating up so much that it becomes uninhabitable, we are talking first and foremost about whether it is livable for us, not other organisms. Life will find a way to continue on this planet with or without humans. In this worldview, the boy from the Giving Tree is a frontline soldier taking advantage of an unsuspecting enemy. I'm joking, of course, for The Giving Tree is a loving story about how much nature has given to enrich our lives. Unlike the story, however, nature doesn't actually have a say in the matter, and whenever humans have encroached upon untouched land, they have regularly upset the delicate balance, resulting in nature fighting back. Sometimes the backlash is so severe that we go to war with the environment, and I literally mean war. American Major William Crawford Gorgas, the Army's chief sanitary officer in Havana, was placed in charge in the war against mosquitoes during the building of the Panama Canal. World War I, II, and the Vietnam War would merely continue the tradition that America comes in to finish a job that the French began. The Europeans began the canal, but were forced out by widespread sickness that Major Gorgas correctly claimed was being spread by mosquitoes. Upon receiving notice of the Congressional Declaration of War, he screened all of the apartments and installed fumigators throughout the work area, allowing the United States to literally cut through the Isthmus of Panama. The Rockefeller Foundation was established in 1915, the year after the canal's completion. The organization studied the Major's work in great detail, launching a worldwide program to study and control mosquito-borne diseases. Historian Timothy Mitchell points out that the foundation utilized military means in its ever-escalating war with mosquitoes. He states that Rockefeller set up a program in Brazil to eliminate the disease from the coastal areas of South America. The leader of the campaign, Dr. Fred Soper, developed eradication methods based on modern warfare, in which brigades of uniformed men armed with spray guns went on search and destroy missions. Disease was to be defeated not by improved social conditions or medical intervention, but by the physical elimination of the enemy species. Detailed maps and index cards recorded the location of houses to be searched, the discovery of each mosquito, and the routes and timings of missions to spray or dump the chemicals. Gorgeous, the military man in charge, eventually was named to the position of Surgeon General of the U.S. Army. Even more incredible, his work during the war against the mosquitoes of Panama resulted in his knighting by the King of England. Of course, that is a bit ridiculous. After all, it is quite easy to kill a mosquito. I've killed hundreds in my own lifetime without the help of an army-grade flamethrower. Few of us balk at killing a mosquito. After all, the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention points out that due to the diseases that they spread, the mosquito is the world's deadliest animal. And Bill Gates, co-founder of Microsoft and the Gates Foundation, points out that while humans kill around 475,000 of their own kind each year through murder, wars, etc., mosquitoes now kill 725,000 people each year through disease transmission. Clearly, mosquitoes are an enemy worth nuking. But what about the other wars against nature that we have summoned the military for? Did they perform as well as the American forces did against the mosquitoes of Panama? Australia knows the answer to those two questions, for in 1932, they declared war against the emus and lost. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series is about Australia's attempts to outsmart the wild. Episode number 2, The Great Emu War. The emu is a large flightless bird indigenous to the Australian continent. The name is quite controversial, as is its pronunciation. Although NPR research and data team approved emu as the acceptable pronunciation for Australia's national bird, traditionalists still cling to emu. The word itself is Arabic for large bird. Portuguese explorers saw cassowaries in eastern Indonesia, another flightless bird which is similar in height but of stockier build. It is believed that the two had the same ancestor at one point before evolution worked its magic. The Portuguese evidently couldn't tell the difference, and the name emu, or large bird, stuck. If you're curious about the ostrich, which is the only bird in Australia that is bigger than this episode's large bird, that word derives from Anglo-Norman/Vulgar Latin for just bird. Europeans would have encountered that large flightless creature far sooner than the emu. In fact, more than 1,000 ostriches are recorded to have been released for the opening ceremonies at the Circus Maximus. And according to the historian Herodian, the Emperor Commodus invented crescent-shaped arrows to decapitate ostriches, thereby creating the spectacle of the birds running around headless. Emus, however, were something quite different. Wildlife Wonders describes them as unique creatures, with small black wings, a small claw at the tip. Their long, strong, featherless legs end in large, soft-cushioned three-toed feet. The skin of their pale blue necks shows through their sparse feathers, and the shaggy plumage around their mid-body is gray-brown. Although they can't fly, they are able to sprint 50 kilometers an hour, which resulted in their Latin name meaning Australian sprinter. They are well designed for the bush regions of Australia, eating a variety of insects and plants, but are able to go weeks between feedings. They also don't need to constantly consume water. Instead, they behave as camels, filling up with copious amounts of liquid when they find it. The bird was marked as special by the First Nations of Australia, and the colonists quickly adopted the Aboriginal appreciation for the flightless birds, placing the emu along with the kangaroo on the nation's first official coat of arms. The reasoning was that the two creatures were thought to be the only two Australian animals that can't move backwards. The coat of arms thus symbolized a nation that is constantly moving forward. One of the most famous of all Aboriginal stories is the emu in the sky. That tale occurs during the Dreaming, the period of time that the original inhabitants believe predated them. In other words, it was their time of creation. The story claims that a blind man lived with his wife in the bush. Plagued by an insatiable hunger for emu eggs, he would tell his wife every day to go gather some for him. Each day she would return with eggs, only to have him tell her that the eggs were too small. One day on her search, the wife came across giant emu tracks. She tracked the bird, determined to please her blind husband, but was killed when she attempted to seize the eggs. The blind man grew hungry and concerned for his wife. Feeling around, he found a bush with berries on them. When he ate the fruit, he was suddenly able to see, and immediately set off to locate his wife. When he followed her tracks and discovered her lifeless body, he killed the emu, banishing its spirit to reside amongst the Milky Way, where it can still be seen today. There are in fact two constellations that are recognized as an emu. Depending upon which one was visible, determined for the Aboriginal peoples whether it was time to hunt the creature or whether it was time to collect their eggs. Those eggs are 10 times the size of a chicken egg and currently go for around $30 a piece. Like chickens, emus can be used for domesticated egg production, during which a female lays an egg approximately every 3 days during the winter. In the wild, the birds have very stringent breeding habits. After the women have fought over a mate, they pair up in the summer and autumn and remain as a pair throughout the winter months. Between 5 to 15 eggs, each the size of a human hand, are laid. From there, it's up to the male, as he sits on the eggs to incubate them. This is a continuous act for 8 weeks, during which the male rarely eats. That can result in them losing as much as half of their original weight, their first sacrifice for their children. That male-focused parental style is odd, even for a bird, as only 2% of bird breeds have the dad responsible for nearly all parental duties. It's even more interesting considering that studies have shown that half of the incubated hatchlings aren't even directly related to dad. Ecologist Julie Ryland is one of those who conduct these studies. She tells Atlas Obscura that while an emu's size is certainly intimidating, it wasn't that difficult to move the eggs around, adding that emus aren't particularly aggressive or especially clever. The ecologist points out that emus will try to get up in your face to scare you, but as soon as you're taller than them and a bit more scary, they just sprint off. They're not very brave. And if you happen to be shorter than an emu, you can fool them into thinking you are taller simply by holding your hand above your head. But if that is the case, then can an entire episode be made about an emu war? The birds aren't totally defenseless. Sharp claws on their toes help them ward off predators. Their kicks are powerful enough to kill a dingo, which is their largest predator in the Australian wild. They also evade threats through dusty camouflage and translucent secondary eyelids that protect their vision from the ever-present dust throughout the outback. They can also communicate as far away as 2 kilometers using a series of booming, drumming, and grunting. While they aren't as aggressive as their cousins, the cassowary, which are listed among the world's most dangerous birds, a 6-foot bird coming at you is worthy of alarm. Knowing what sets them off is critical, with farming base telling us that if they observe an unexpected movement of a limb or a human wearing a certain color, nothing can keep them from chasing and attacking the human. If this happens to you, make sure that you're watching out for the claws, as an emu's beak is soft, and in order to protect its vulnerable neck, will raise itself to its full height during the attack. And that is about as dangerous as I can make them sound. In fact, there are some in Australia who keep emus as domesticated pets, ranking them as less dangerous than a hamster and only slightly more than a dog. Yet still, Australia went to war with the flightless bird and lost. That portion of the story begins on January 1st, 1901. When 6 colonies were joined together to create the Commonwealth of Australia, a self-governing dominion of the British Empire. While it would be allowed to make its own domestic decisions, the United Kingdom would remain fully in control of the continent's international affairs. Thus, when England joined World War I, Australia was drawn into the fight against its will. One of the trendiest ways of explaining World War I in education is to portray it as a bar fight. Picture this, a crowded pub, and in the center, Germany, Austria, and Italy, sharing a moment until a clumsy move by Serbia sends ripples through the scene. Austria, with a pint in hand, is quick to demand Serbia buys it a new suit after the spill. Germany, ever the ally, supports Austria's claim. Meanwhile, Britain urges everyone to calm down, and Serbia, unable to afford a full suit, offers to clean Austria's trousers. As tensions rise, Russia and Serbia share a meaningful glance at Austria, prompting questions. Austria, defensive, challenges Serbia, and Russia steps in, advising Austria to leave its little brother alone. Germany, seizing an opportunity, draws Britain's attention to France's gaze, creating a new layer of complexity. Britain fires back, asserting its right to look wherever it pleases, provoking Germany. Threats escalate, alliances shift, and the pub becomes a stage for international drama. Turkey and Germany huddle, whispering secrets, before Turkey, defiant, avoids eye contact with everyone. Germany, now the instigator, rolls up its sleeves and takes on Belgium, setting off a chain reaction. France and Britain retaliate. Austria joins the fray against Russia, and chaos ensues. Surprising everyone, Italy delivers a punch to its ally Austria, altering the dynamics once again. Australia and New Zealand throw punches at Turkey, establishing its place in the chaos. They subsequently get punched back. But there are no hard feelings, though, because everybody knows that Britain made Australia do it. Amid broken chairs and shattered glass, America, biding its time, chooses the perfect moment to intervene, smashing Germany with a bar stool and claiming victory for itself. In the aftermath of the destroyed bar, blame is assigned. Britain, France, and America collectively agree that Germany started it all. Seizing the opportunity, they search Germany's pockets, pilfer its wallet, and generously buy drinks for their friends. Jokes aside, World War I was as awful for Australia as it was for the rest of the world. The outbreak of hostilities was initially met with enthusiasm from the land down under. Within a month of declaring war, they found themselves fighting in the Middle East as well as on the Western Front. Although they were important on all fronts, they were particularly spectacular in the Middle East. The Australian War Memorial describes their contribution, writing that the Middle East campaign began in 1916 with Australian troops taking part in the defense of the Suez Canal and the Allied reconquest of the Sinai Desert. In the following year, Australian and other Allied troops advanced into Palestine and captured Gaza and Jerusalem. By 1918, they had occupied Lebanon and Syria, and on October 30th, 1918, Turkey sued for peace. Victory came at a great cost. World War I remains Australia's costliest conflict in terms of its casualty rate. From a population of less than 5,416,000 men enlisted, 60,000 of which were killed, while another 156,000 were wounded, gassed, or taken prisoner. The war hardened those left behind at the home front. Women took on more financial responsibilities, and anti-German sentiment resulted in the creation of internment camps. 7,000 were detained under the banners of people of enemy nations who were naturalized British subjects, Australian-born descendants of migrants born in enemy nations, and others who were thought to pose a threat to Australia's security. Obviously, internment of one's own citizens is less than ideal, and history rarely looks back upon the act fondly. But the Australian camps were far better than many of their peers. Philip Whitman was aboard a German shipping freighter when the war broke out. He initially resided in a British internment camp in Hong Kong. His diary makes special notice of the heat, bamboo huts, and threat of typhoons, as well as the hazing rituals performed when new prisoners arrived in camp. Whitman was then transferred to Australia after the Hong Kong camp was shut down in 1916. His diary notes the difference for us, writing that, "Here we have a real theater, and in a few days also a cinema, sports grounds, etc. We have an excellent little orchestra and regular concerts, wrestling and boxing matches, and inevitably also a gymnastics club and a choral society, and 2 bowling alleys. There are cafeterias with all sorts of beverages and baked goods, but there is no booze to be had, which is just as well because it would lead to murder and battery." War affects everyone, and while historians have exhaustively looked at the lost generation of Germany, they often neglect the suffering of the victors. SBS, an Australian news source, points out that the effects of World War I lingered long in Australia. Emotions ran high when American President Woodrow Wilson questioned Australia's representatives' authority to intervene in world affairs, quote, "as the leader of a mere 5 million people." The Prime Minister responded that he speaks for 60,000 dead. "For how many do you speak, Mr. President?" In the subsequent Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to agree to pay Australia £6.6 billion. But the land down under only received $275 million of that astonishing total, with the final payment being handed over in 2010. The need for such reparations was legit. SBS News informs us that the long-term cost of medical care and welfare benefits to returned soldiers and the dependents of those who didn't return was on a scale never before encountered. By 1938, 77,000 incapacitated soldiers and 180,000 dependents remained on pensions that by then had cost Australia nearly £148 million annually. England's own difficulty, as well as the shockwaves of America's Great Depression, hit the island hard, as Australia was wholeheartedly dependent on industrial capital from England. In 1932, unemployment reached a staggering 29% of the working population, a record for Australia. Although you never hear it reported, it was one of the highest in the world. For comparison's sake, American unemployment at the peak of the Great Depression was merely 22.5%. It took the U.S. a full decade to recover. An agricultural heavyweight from its colonial days, returned soldiers were resettled on rural blocks of land. Seeking replacements for their lost population, more than 200,000 government-sponsored British immigrants arrived with the promise of striking it rich. The National Museum of Australia reveals that the nation fell for its own propaganda. as during the First World War, popular imagery of the sturdy, independent yeoman merged with that of the noble, patriotic digger to create a powerful symbolic character, the soldier-settler, a worthy figure capable of promoting social stability and economic productivity. Unfortunately, farming anywhere is quite difficult, and more so in the lands that Australia was using to expand its territorial foothold. 40 returned servicemen took up land in Western Australia in Carnama. The museum informs us that initially Carnama grew into a thriving service center as soldier settlers, many already married, arrived to establish farms and families. The labor-intensive nature of farming created demand for workers. As the population rose, the new arrivals formed sporting and social clubs that met regularly at Carnama or in smaller centers elsewhere in the district. When the soldier settlers first arrived, most of the district remained undeveloped bush and pastoral land. Settlers made and bought devices to clear the shrubs for cropping. As in many parts of Australia, the subsoils beneath the slightly undulating county of the Carnama area are rich in salts. Settlers replaced native trees, shrubs, and grasses, a plant community able to hold and use water efficiently, with bare, cultivated earth and short-rooted annual crops. Water seeped below and brought destructive salts to the surface. Returned soldier Tom White and his wife Hilda called their Carnama district farm Rosedale. As the decades passed, clearing and cropping on Rosedale had unfortunate consequences. The creek running past the homestead turned saline, and any trees remaining beside the waterway sickened and died. Things only got worse from there. Across Australia, falling wheat prices caused widespread hardship for farmers. As worldwide demand for food imports went up, the United States, Argentina, and Canada became the sought-after markets. Those nations' own efforts at recovery meant that the world had an overabundance of Australia's two major exports, wheat and sheep. Factoring in the distance between Australia and the market meant that they were effectively priced out by their competitors in the Americas. The farmers had been given a promise to go along with a dream, but as struggles increased, loans dried up and payments mounted. England shifting to the gold standard while Australia stubbornly remained on its own meant that domestic wool prices dropped steadily, halving the value of their exports in 1929 and 1930. The government was forced to turn to austerity measures in the 1928 budget in an effort to deal with a £5.5 million deficit. Nothing seemed to help as the government limited the right to strike, raised tariff barriers, and artificially reduced immigration levels. Struggles such as these resulted in the scapegoating of others. For Germany, it was the Jews who had stabbed them in the back in World War I. The U.S., under the leadership of President Herbert Hoover, blamed Mexican Americans for the Great Depression, while Australia turned against the second largest flightless bird in order to explain their troubles. Following traditional migration patterns, 20,000 emus suddenly arrived to these struggling farms completely unaware of the collapse of the world markets. One can forgive their ignorance, as their bird brains were solely focused upon the looming breeding season. The newly resettled farms had just cleared land and created additional water supplies for livestock. Almost immediately, the emus found that the cultivated lands represented a great habitat, and they began to wander into farm territory with reckless abandon. It didn't help that the farmers had been holding back their wheat crop from the government in a desperate attempt to artificially raise prices. Emu are generally nomadic, but aren't against staying in one place if food and water can be found in abundance. They also eat any plants and bugs that are readily available, which meant that when they weren't snatching the cultivated crops, they were competing with livestock for available grass. Settler Ralph English claimed that the worst part about emus is what they flatten. They just trample around on the crop and knock it all over. Additionally, the birds, which are tall, flightless, with powerful claws, ripped through the Australian rabbit fences in order to complete their migration. The resulting flood of rabbits wreaked even more damage upon the already struggling farms. At first, the locals attempted to drive the emu herds away with some unorthodox methods. The website History Nuggets writes that some enterprising local boys in the Walgoolan area hopped on their bicycles and tried riding down the emus, swatting the birds in the head with sticks as they sped by, reportedly killing as many as 27 in one day. Farmers also tried hiring a local motorist to attempt the same tactic, pursuing the emus in his truck as townspeople swung clubs while perched on the running boards. But the vehicle's engine frightened the birds before they could get close enough, and the exercise was deemed too costly. The emus persisted, and perhaps became even more wary of humans as a result of the townspeople's efforts. The boys had had their chance. It was time for the men to get involved. Now keep in mind that quite a few of these farmers were resettled war veterans. They initially tried to shoot the birds themselves, but had trouble accessing the ammunition that they needed. Scientific American tells us that even these men, trained riflemen who felled thousands of the mighty birds, could not put a dent in their numbers. Bounties were put on their beaks, but to no avail. The emus were such a problem that the Minister of Defense, George Pierce, agreed to meet with a group of the ex-soldiers. The birds had already lost their protective native status in 1922. A decade later, they were declared enemy number 1. George Pierce was one of those bureaucrats that exemplifies the infamous Reagan quote that the 9 scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government, and I'm here to help." Historian Ingeborg van Tesserling reveals to us that Pierce was a political survivor, spending 24 years within the cabinet before going on to spend another 37 years as a senator. There were a number of reasons for Defense Minister Pierce to mobilize his forces. First, the government was desperate to visibly show that it was supporting the farmers in any way possible. By all accounts, the government truly did respect the sacrifices that these men had made during World War I. Thus far, their land redistribution proposals had been a complete and utter failure. Secondly, the government believed that the operation would be an excellent chance for live ammunition training for the next generation of Aussie troops. Specifically, it would help them target the fast-moving vehicles that were quickly becoming a staple in modern warfare. Machine guns and automobiles were relatively new and advancing technology, and opportunities like this were hard to manufacture. Third, the government was increasingly concerned about a growing secession movement. A referendum was even held on whether Western Australia should abandon the nation. Incredibly, 66% of the voters supported the move, but the vote was not legally binding, and the federal government decided to ignore the voters' demands. Taking action against the encroaching emus could help the bureaucrats in Sydney tangibly display that there were indeed benefits to the people of Western Australia if they stayed within the Union. It also wouldn't hurt that the sight of the deployed machine gun-wielding army might also chill the dissent that was brewing in the outback. The first step for the government bureaucracy was to agree on the plan of action. Only then did they stop by the local offices of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in an attempt to gain their support. Before green-lighting the doomed project, the Society insisted upon their officers being embedded within the armed forces to ensure that the animals were not allowed to suffer. Pierce saw the plan as both beneficial and practical, so without notifying his superiors in the distant national capital of Canberra, he informed the farmers of the Champion district that they would have their assistance, provided the machine guns would be manned by professional soldiers trained in their use, and the farmers would provide all lodging, food, and ammunition. The Farmers' Agricultural Bank agreed to front the government for the ammunition, to be repaid out of the farmers' future profits, and provided an indemnity towards any damage caused during the operation. Colonel Hoyd of the Australian Light Horse, hearing of the plan, placed an order for 1,000 feathered emu skins in order to make plumage for his horsemen's iconic hats. The foolhardy expedition was underway. The weapon of choice was the American-designed Lewis light machine gun. The weapon had been utilized throughout the World War, both on the ground and mounted on planes. It fired 600 rounds per minute from its single barrel with an effective range of 880 yards. 10,000 rounds of prepaid ammo joined Major G.P.W. Meredith, the commander of the 7th Heavy Battery in Perth. He joined Sergeant McMurray and Gunner O'Halloran aboard a train destined for enemy territory in early October of 1932. Confident that modern science could conquer the beast, they brought along a Fox Movietone cameraman to capture all of the action. Rains hindered the operation for the entire first month, preventing their efforts at herding the bird towards the Army's predetermined killing grounds. Embarrassed at their failure to shoot a single bird, they packed up and headed to their second destination of Burracoppin. In transit, they spotted a mob of 40 to 50 emus and decided to forego tactical reconnaissance and began the operation without any planning. Keep in mind that these large birds aren't the smartest. There's a reason that people use the term bird brain when they want to insult someone's intelligence. I already pointed out that one ecologist successfully confused them by putting one arm up in the air in order to convince her foe that she was the taller, scarier emu. I've even seen video of individuals getting on the ground and moving their legs in the air, as though they were riding a bicycle upside down. From the bird's vantage point, the sight appears to be two emu heads bobbing in motion, the result of which was a good dozen emus coming by to check the fool out. In general, they're good-natured, but the one thing that they universally don't like are loud noises, and 1932 technology was quite loud. Despite bearing the name light, these machine guns weren't overly mobile, so Major Meredith hired 20 locals to use their cars to herd the birds within the 880-yard range of the killing machines. However, emus don't stampede in a straight line like other animals. Instead, they scatter in all directions whenever they are startled, and thus the farmers were completely ineffectual at wrangling the beasts. Although no emu got closer than 1,000 yards, Meredith fired anyway in frustration. In the first encounter with the enemy, the Australian Army came up empty-handed. Doubling down, Meredith got 50 locals and vehicles to attempt to again flank the birds. This time, his gunners' indiscriminate fire managed to hit and kill 6 of the 50 sighted birds at a range of 1,400 yards. History Nuggets reveals that on the following day, Meredith ordered that his men set up base camp about 30 miles north of Wollongong, with operations concentrated primarily on the Perry, Joyce, and McGeorge farms in the area. Again, the soldiers spotted a herd of emus, and packing into trucks and accompanied by 9 cars of cheering locals, stormed after the birds. They killed 9, but only after the birds devastated a local farm. Observers noted that the emus were seeming to quickly learn or already knew the range limits of the machine guns, and would rarely venture within 1,000 yards of the men. Word had even spread among the observing townspeople that the birds had chosen leaders who had specifically helped coordinate the emus' emergency evacuation maneuvers. The great Chinese war tactician Sun Tzu rightfully notes that those who are able to adapt and change in accord with the enemy and achieve victory are called divine. Needing to alter their tactics in order to keep up with the enemy, Meredith proceeded to set up an ambush at a well-known watering hole. Almost immediately, 30 emu were lured into the clutches of his hidden soldiers. Over the course of several hours, the soldiers fired 150 rounds, but when the smoke cleared, there wasn't a single feathered body to be found. This doesn't mean that they didn't hit anything. After all, locals had warned him that the thick skin of an emu was capable of absorbing 5 to 6 direct hits. In his later reports, Meredith would concede that the emu is an amazingly hard bird to kill outright, as many carry mortal wounds up to a distance of a half-mile. Despite yet another setback, he stubbornly maintained his position, and on November 4th, a mob of 100 emus appeared at point-blank range. The NRA's American Rifleman series teaches us that World War I turned our planet into a slaughterhouse, with more than 8 million battlefield deaths and 22 million troops wounded. Machine guns, newly deployed in great numbers in combat, were responsible for much of the killing. Individual machine gunners killed many hundreds of men advancing before their guns. Some gunners collapsed mentally and emotionally after hours of unrelenting slaughter, realizing they had become the Grim Reaper personified. Thus, when 100 defenseless and flightless birds appeared at point-blank range in front of 2 experienced gunners, there was to be no escape. Except there was, for 88 of the targets, as only 12 of the enemy were killed before the guns jammed. It had taken 4 engagements spread over a period of 2 months. But the trained soldiers had now surpassed the total kills of what had been previously done in one day by a bunch of stick-wielding local boys on bikes. Despite the ridiculousness of that fact, the footage that was shot was picked up by the press and shown throughout the country, proclaiming that in the war against the emus, the tables have turned, and there will be no more damage done here for many a day to come. Mao Zedong, the victorious general of the Chinese Civil War, famously proclaimed that whenever the enemy retreats, we advance. Taking the fight to the birds, the Aussies mounted their machine guns atop a pickup truck, but due in part to the lack of paved roads in the outback, the trained gunner was unable to discharge a single shot. Frustrated at the Army's failed efforts, one local farmer decided to just deal with the situation himself and ran over one of the fleeing birds, only to find the doomed bird's corpse entangled with his steering gear. His unresponsive truck proceeded to run off the road, destroying a huge section of the nation's anti-rabbit fence. Credible estimates had put the enemy forces at 20,000. 3 months into operations, they had killed somewhere between 1 to 500, with most historians agreeing that it was probably closer to the lower of the two numbers. Facing reality, Meredith attempted to put a positive spin on the situation, pointing out to a reporter that not a single human casualty had yet to occur. Despite the brave face, he knew that he was in trouble. After yet another failed ambush, the frustrated major declared that emus can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks. One of his soldiers concurred, proclaiming that there's only one way to kill an emu. Shoot him through the back of the head when his mouth is closed, or through the front of his mouth when his mouth is open. That's how hard it is. By this point, the press was openly making fun of the government's efforts. Pierce had taken the initiative of running the operation himself, neglecting to inform the higher ranks of the Australian government. Soon, the Prime Minister was being asked questions about the Great Emu War, something that he initially had zero knowledge of. It didn't help that Meredith continued his propaganda efforts, telling reporters false tales of the bird's capabilities, such as when he stated for the record that the emus have proved that they are not so stupid as they are usually considered to be. Each mob has its leader, always an enormous black-plumed bird standing full 6 feet high, who keeps watch while his fellows busy themselves with the wheat. At the first suspicious sign, he gives the signal, and dozens of heads stretch up out of the crop. A few birds will take fright, starting a headlong stampede for the scrub, the leader always remaining until his followers have reached safety. The fight eventually spilled into the halls of Parliament, with one Labour politician cynically asking whether or not a medal was to be struck for those taking part. A word of advice for anyone out there who hopes to one day function within a British-styled parliament. For within those halls, you never want to leave yourself open to an opposition taunt, as the man's counterpart quickly retorted that if there is a medal, it ought to go to the emus, who have won every round thus far. Even Meredith's superior officer was furious with the major, for he had been promised 100 skins with which to make hats with, and a month in, not a single hide had been procured. Meredith, McMurray, and O'Halloran were all recalled on November 10th. Not realizing the ridiculousness of all of it, Meredith loudly protested, informing the press that he had been up against a fearsome enemy, and if we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks, he continued. They are like Zulus, whom even dum-dum bullets could not stop. His pleas to see the job done somehow worked, and after a grassroots lobbying campaign targeted Western Australia's Premier James Mitchell, Meredith was restored to his task. One surviving telegraph read, "Gunners withdrawn, imperative they should stay. Emus beginning to reappear in large numbers. Can you do anything? Wire me immediately." The expectation was that the previous experience of the group's effort would pay off over time. Despite this, Van Tesseling informs us that during the last 2 weeks of November, the soldiers killed, their leader said, more than 700 emus and wounded 2,500. They had used every single bullet to do so. By the time Meredith was withdrawn again on December 2nd, almost 1,000 emus had fallen. An estimated 19,000, and their new chicks were left. By now, everyone was following the daily dispatches from the front lines. Keep in mind that there were very real stakes involved here. The Western secession crisis played in the front of everyone's minds within the halls of power in Sydney. Individual political fates hung on the outcome as well, with Prime Minister Pearce being targeted for his ineptitude in 1937. The Wheat Growers Union led the way, calling for voters to put Pearce last. Eager for positive results, Western Australia Premier Sir James Mitchell cited massive damage inflicted on 3 farms by the birds, although much of that defilement was likely caused by either indiscriminate gunfire or the dozens of accompanying cars and trucks that were used indiscriminately to herd the beasts. History Nuggets informs us that the second sojourn in the Champion District did not fare much better than the first. On the day of their arrival, the gunners set an ambush, but misestimated their range. By the time they had changed barrels to compensate, the emus once again scattered in their typical chaotic pattern, and the 2 men killed only 20 birds. On November 15th, the soldiers tried switching to rifles and stalking the birds, to no avail. They then tried splitting their force of 3, deploying O'Halloran to the north as McMurray and Meredith headed south towards Wollongong. The latter two drove a herd of emus back towards and right over an overwhelmed O'Halloran position. The embedded animal welfare officer who accompanied the men admitted that he had little to do, due to the birds' ability to continue to operate so well even when grievously wounded. To add to the ineptitude, someone left a gate in the rabbit-proof fence open, allowing a good number of bunnies and emus alike to push into the supposedly protected interior before the gate was again closed. The campaign was a massive failure, resulting in Meredith literally making up the numbers, as his final report claims that they used 9,860 rounds of the 10,000 purchased in order to kill the suspiciously easily divisible number of 986 birds. Keep in mind that the terms of the deal originally struck meant that the settlers were footed with the bill for all of the high-priced ammunition. They were left holding the bag, surrounded by 19,000 of the 20,000 birds that may have at this point decided to settle in the area permanently. One settler, Daniel O'Leary, expressed his outrage to the government by cleverly altering Major Meredith's name to Major Murdereth. He claimed that the government ought to pay him for bashing out the brains of such of the enemy wounded so could be found after each engagement, and for victualling his majesty's troops, who had also thrashed his land and broken his truck. Seeking to make lemonade out of life's lemons, two farmers attempted to pay their annual government tax bill with emu hides. Unwilling to learn from the past, Western farmers continued to request machine gun crews in 1934, 1938, and incredibly in 1943, when Australia was in the midst of World War II. Japan had managed to successfully bomb the continent in 1942, dispatching 235 Aussies in one fateful run. In addition to outrage, that attack lit a light bulb among the settlers, who began to alter their petitions to the government from machine gun squads to aerial bombing runs. Officially, the war against the emus ended on December 10, 1932, with the rising price of ammunition given as the main reason for its end. Having only killed 1,000 of the 20,000 emus, it's impossible to not see the war as a victory for the birds. The Perth Daily News sarcastically declared as much, noting that no treaty of peace has been concluded, and the emus remain in possession of disputed territory. It is therefore expected that regular military operations will be followed by guerrilla warfare, which may continue for years and may be accompanied by stories of horrible atrocities. The emu commander is maintaining a studied silence as to his future plans, but it is understood that he is much impressed with the capacity for resistance shown by raw troops and confident that they will continue to uphold the best traditions of the race. He is credited with the intention to arrange for a suitable poem to commemorate the emu glory on the field of Campione. Today, the emu runs free, proliferating across the land down under. In fact, despite Australia's efforts, the birds are now classified as a species of least concern, as there are perhaps more than 1 million wreaking havoc throughout the continent. Amazingly, it, along with rabbits, are one of the few species which have grown in population since the English colonized the land. And they ought to be happy with that, as Matthew Fielding, an emu researcher at the University of Tasmania, points out that any reduction in the emu population could have a substantial impact on an ecosystem, because the birds play an important role as seed dispersers. They'll eat anything, he says, literally anything, walk along for great distances, and then poop it out in this beautiful substrat of emu poop. I think we can all tell which side of the war Mr. Fielding would have been on. The rest of Australia still sees them as a pest, an animal that turned on them in such a way that Americans could only understand if the bald eagle began to prey upon us, or if Canada's moose began to sharpen their antlers in order to spear a few Mounties. To rural Australians, the war is merely in the state of a pause, waiting for either side to get the upper hand. In lieu of the restarting of hostilities, the flightless birds' population is somewhat contained by a bounty program, as well as specific emu-proof additions to the many animal fences that crisscross Australia. There are no significant tributes to the men who courageously fought the Great Emu War, nor the birds which were unjustly slain in battle. While one will occasionally stumble across a handmade marker inscribed with such inspired names of the victims like Emu 1 and Emu 49, it is clear that Australia would prefer to forget its feathery fiasco. Unfortunately, legendary comedian John Cleese of Monty Python fame won't seem to allow it, as he plans to produce and star in a major motion picture about the conflict. Although emus don't actually cluck, I really hope that the film takes some liberty from the most famous line of Die Hard, with Cleese yelling, "Yippee-ki-yay, mother clucker." I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowry@gmail.com or find us on the platform formerly known as Twitter. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.